All right. I think it's saying it's recording. Hopefully that's working out just fine. All right. Well, welcome everybody. What we're going to do, this is part of the uh, course that's finishing up in October. And the purpose again of these sessions is to really give you an opportunity as you've been studying the textbook and the like to raise any questions, anything that's confusing to you. I will note that next week I'm not going to hold this session. I'm going to be traveling. So if you have a question, just send me an email. I'll try and deal with it individually. In the meantime, you can review the videos that have already been posted by similar sessions in past classes. They're listed. The links are in the email that I sent you out for this one today. So hopefully that's not going to cause anyone an issue, but I know how much you look forward to these weekly meetings to listen to me wander through the textbook. So at this stage, you really should be at finishing up chapter 5, maybe getting into chapter 6 a little bit. And so just to recap, I thought what I would focus on here is to talk about to do a wire sizing exercise, talk about all the different components within a typical array, sizing the wire and the components as we go through that example. I think if my memory serves, we did that last week as well. But then I also thought maybe looking at PV Watts and online remote solar assessment tools. Specifically, the one that I like to work with is called Open Solar. And Open Solar is a way of doing your remote site assessments without, it doesn't cost money. There's no subscription fee to it. So that's one of the nice things. Some of these remote site assessment tools are pretty pricey. They can be hundreds of dollars a month to subscribe to. So Open Solar does everything that I needed to do and is free. So it sort of markets itself, makes its money by it has a consulting aspect to it. If you need to go further in you can get project ready blueprints and things like that made. But then they also promote some certain product throughout the system. So it might highlight an inverter or a panel as first choice when you're selecting things. So they're kind of pushing product that way. To me, I don't care. If I have a specific product that I want, you can select that. Otherwise, I really don't care what product's being pushed at me. So, okay, so yeah, there was a question there. Will the certification test allow any materials at all to be used? You'll have a calculator, and you'll have a scrap piece of paper and a pencil and your knowledge. You're not allowed to bring in any other support materials, no textbook, no reference documents of any sort. One of the things that I do recommend when you sit down, there are a couple of equations that you need to have memorized or at least know how to use. The power equation, watts equals amps times volts, pretty straightforward. Ohm's law, which is volts equals amps times resistance, or VER, volts equals amps times resistance. And then there's the voltage drop equation. And voltage drop is really just Ohm's law adjusted for distance. In fact, here, let me show you the whiteboard here. All right. So Ohm's law, well, watts equals amps times volts. And Ohm's law is volts equals amps times resistance. I always just think of it as VER. And then voltage drop is voltage drop equals amps. And we're typically talking about the IMP rating on your panel times resistance times twice the distance divided by 1,000 feet. The reason we do twice the distance divided by 1,000 feet is the resistance characteristics. The resistance you're given is ohms per 1,000 feet. And you get that out of the NEC through the table. The table's in your book. So the fact that we're given a resistance in a number of ohms, but it's based on per 1,000 feet, well, then we need to know what portion of 1,000 feet you're dealing with. And so it's twice the distance because every circuit, it's a circuit. So it runs there and it runs back. So we need to know that distance. And so if it's a 200-foot run, it's going to be 200 times 2 divided by 1,000, or it's going to be 0.4. So that's all. It's just, voltage drop is just Ohm's law adjusted for resistance. Hopefully that's clear. All right. So that jumps in since I've got the whiteboard. Let's quickly walk through an example. Let's say I've got a solar array here. And because we're dealing with wire size, we're going to deal with amps. Amps are what we use for wire size. And when we're sizing the wire, we want to use the ISC because that's the worst case scenario. That's the theoretical maximum amps that a panel can generate. And when we hook together a panel in a string, the amps stay the same, but the voltage increases. So the voltage limitation is limited by what the NEC says. In this case, it's going to be 600 volts DC because it's a residential system. The amps, well, that's primarily limited by the capacity of the wire to carry that load without, destroying the wire. So if I've got a system with 3 strings coming out and going into a combiner box from the array, and if the ISC is, let's say it's, just going to throw a number out, 11.2 amps, and the IMP in this case is going to be, let's say, 10.7 amps, and the VMP, let's make them a 350 watt panel. So I'm going to take 350 watts divided by 10.7 amps, gives me 32.71. 32.71 volts is the VMP, because VMP times IMP is going to equal the power of the panel. And then VOC, I don't care. All I know is that it's going to be more than this. So let's just say 36.2 volts. So you would get that off of the panel specifications. That's where you would get that. But I just need some numbers that make some sort of sense. So now I want to do my wire sizing. Well, what size wire do I need that's going to run from the panel to the combiner box? Well, I happen to know that these things are going to be pigtailed. They're the wires that are connected to the panels, and we daisy chain them together. So we know that they're 12 gauge. That's just what we get in today's solar panels, residential for sure. So what is the limitation of a 12 gauge panel, I think, or wire? And I think it's somewhere in here in the early 100s. Here we go. Yeah, page 104. So 12 gauge wire, we read it from the left-hand column. So 12 gauge wire has 25 amp capacity. So 25 amps, well, let's make sure that we're within that. We start out with 10.7, and then we have to multiply that times 1.25, which is the NEC safety margin. And then we multiply that times another safety factor, which is solar. And we do that as long as that solar panel hasn't hit some sort of piece of electronics. The reason we do that is because the sunlight, all of these numbers is based on 1,000 watts per square meter, or the insolation or solar irradiance. We know that actually can be higher than that. I've had readings as high as 1,200. So we just have another safety factor. So if I take that 10.7 times 1.25 times 1.25, and that's going to give me 16.72. All right, so my wire has to at least carry that. 12 gauge is 25 amps, so that's fine. So we're going to come in here with 12 gauge, and it's going to be 16.72 amps. Now we go into a combiner box, and that combiner box, all three of these strings are connected in parallel. Well, what happens in parallel? Voltage remains the same, but amps increase. So what does it increase? Well, there are three of them. So we're going to take that 16.72 times 3 strings, and that's going to give us 50.15. So the wire here has to be able to carry 50.15 amps. So if I look up in column 1 in the table, 6 gauge wire can carry 55 amps. Cool beans, we're going to go with 6 gauge wire because it will handle that. Now, notice I'm saying this wire has to be capable of carrying a little more than 50 amps. But realistically, what is that wire going to be carrying? Well, it's really going to be carrying 3 times 10.7. And I think I already made a mistake in my calculations here because I used the IMP, but I should have been using for my calculations the ISC. So here, 11.2 amps. All right, so now I'm going to confuse everybody because we want worst case scenario times 1.25 times 1.25 equals 17.5. Okay, so that's now 17.5 amps. Still fine, but it's now 17.5, not 16. And 17.5 times 3 is going to give us 52.5 amps. Okay, so we're still good. 52.5 amps. All right, I worried that it might get over 55, which would mean that we couldn't use 6 gauge. So 52.5, 6 gauge. So what are we really transporting? We're really transporting 3 times 10.7. So 10.7 times 3 is going to be, what's that, 32.1 amps. I think that's right if it's in my head. So even though we're really transporting 32.1 amps, we have to design it so it's capable of 52.5. There's an awful lot of safety margins built into all of this stuff. So just be aware of that. We want to plan for the worst. Get rid of some of this mess here. All right, so what's the next piece of equipment we go to? Well, from the combiner box, we're going to go to a DC disconnect. All right, the DC disconnect has to be located within 10 feet of the inverter. Typically with our systems today, it's going to be built into the inverter, but it doesn't have to be. It just has to be located near it. What size DC disconnect? Well, if they come in bus bar sizes of 30 amp, 60 amp, 100 amp, we'd want to make sure this is 60 amp. Then if there was a fuse in here, we'd probably want to go with a 55 amp fuse. You round up to the next available size. Now, coming through the DC disconnect, does anything change with the ampacity requirements of the wire? No, it doesn't, because it's just simply an interrupt. It just interrupts the flow. It opens, it closes, it opens, it closes. So nothing has changed. So on this side, we're still going with 6 gauge. And then we go to our inverter. Okay, so what size inverter? Well, that's going to be a function of the array. So let's say that we've decided these are 10 in a string. We have 3 strings, so it's 30 panels, and 30 panels times 350 watts per panel is 10,500 watts. So I'm going to say this is a 10.5 kW array. So 3 strings of 10. That's kind of how we're designing this. So what size inverter do we need? Well, it is a relationship with the size of the array, but it doesn't have to be the size of the array. It can be something smaller than the array. And let me see if I can explain that. I don't think we've gotten to clipping yet. I'm going to erase this just to get a little bit of space over here. But let's say I decide, for reasons of availability, that I'm going to use a 7.6 kW inverter. So I have a 10.5 kW array. I have a 7.6 kW inverter. And so the inverter load ratio on that, 10.5 divided by 7.6, gives me 1.38. It's pretty high. 1.3 is kind of where we want to be, I guess, somewhere in that region. So this is the inverter load ratio. So in theory, I could get by with a 7.6 kW inverter. So let's say I do a 7.6 kW inverter. Well, why can I get by with that? Well, let's say that this is my daily production curve. And it looks like this, and it's solar noon, it peaks out. And then as it gets darker, so this is solar noon here. And this is the size of the array. So under standard test conditions, let's say I had a 7.6 kW array with a 7.6 kW inverter. So this would be 7.6 kW. And my inverter limitation flows right along here. So I'm capturing all of the power that my array is generating. Now I go ahead and I install a larger solar array, a 10.5 kW. Well, my production curve is going to look something more like this. All right, but my inverter can only generate 7.6, so I'm losing all of this power. That's known as clipping. I've clipped it. That on the surface looks bad, right? I'm generating power, but I'm not harvesting it because I've clipped it. But the other thing that you've got to take into account is all of this power generation at the shoulder is additional power. So this is power I'm generating that I wouldn't have generated had I had an array that's the same size as my inverter. In many cases, the power that's clipped is equal to or less than the extra power that's generated out here in the shoulders. So you're not really losing power on a day that meets standard test conditions. You're kind of breaking even. But then you say, well, if I'm breaking even, why am I spending that much more money on an array when I didn't have to? And the reason is because it's not normal to be operating under standard test conditions. most of the days out of the year, 90% or better, are going to be less than ideal. There's going to be cloud cover. It's going to be warmer. It's going to be lots of different things. So most of your activity is going to be down below this 7.6 cutoff mark anyway. So you generate a lot more power with a bigger array and a smaller inverter, just because the cost ratios, the relative cost of solar is cheap compared to the relative cost of an inverter. That's in today's market. Nothing would be a problem. It would not be a problem if I put a 10.5 kW inverter here. No problem. I just have to spend more money. And I might not get that much more production. But what I will show you is it might cause a problem when I go to connect to my service panel. So I'm going to get rid of all of this over here so that we can work in this part of the diagram. Okay, so I'm going with my 7.6 kW. From here, I go to an AC disconnect. The AC disconnect has to be located within 10 feet of my meter, my electric meter outside, be externally operable, and be well marked. All right, what size wire do I need here? Well, things have changed. It's no longer 6 gauge, right? Now it's based on the output of the inverter. Well, a 7.6 kW inverter, and it's 240 volts, and that's going to give us, I believe, 32, 7,600 divided by 240 equals 31.67. 31.67 amps. Now we have to multiply this times the safety margin that the NEC requires for wire sizing. And we do that times 1.25. And we end up at 39.6, or basically 40 amps without the rounding. All right, so I need 40 amps coming out. I need capacity for 40 amps. So I look at my table and I read that 8 gauge wire will provide us with 40 amps. So leaving here, it's going to be 40 amps, and it's going to be 8 gauge wire. All right, so we come to the AC disconnect. Is that a 30 amp, 60 amp, 100 amp? It's probably going to be a 60 amp unit. And if there's a fuse in here, it's going to be a 40 amp fuse. You round up to the next available fuse. So we put a 40 amp fuse in that AC disconnect. Then we leave here. It's still going to be 8 gauge wire because nothing's changed with the amps. And then I'm going to come and connect into my service panel. I've got a breaker here, and then I'm going to hook into a breaker that's as far away from the main as possible. Let's assume this is a 200 amp bus bar panel with 200 amps service coming from the utility. So because of the 120% rule, we can come in with a 40 amp breaker. Well, a 40 amp breaker means I can come in with up to 32 amps. So that's why we went with the 7.6 kW inverter, because anything larger than that, I wouldn't be able to use that load side connection. Because what would happen? Let's say I had a 10.5. If I divide 10.5 divided by 240 volts, that means it's actually 43.75 times 1.25 equals about 55. So 55 amps is what I would have to design my wire for. I'd have to put a 55 amp breaker in here, and I couldn't do that with the 120% rule. I'd have to either do a supply side connection, or I would have to increase the size of my service panel. And if you've upgraded your service panels, it's expensive. It's going to be $2,000 or $3,000 for an electrician to come in and put in a new service panel. So we kind of like to avoid that. So this is why I wanted to go with a 7.6 versus a 10.5 kW inverter. I saved a little bit of money on my inverter. I didn't have to spend money. I didn't lose that much power, and I didn't have to spend the money on the upgrade of my service panel. Does that all make sense to everybody? Any confusion on that? I'll let you take a shot of this if you want, then I'm going to get rid of it. Okay, gonna stop the share. Okay, so then the other thing I wanted to touch base with here quickly is I'm going to go into PV watts in case you haven't done that yet. I want to make you aware of that. So I'll go back here to share. And share my screen. Okay, so hopefully you guys are now seeing the PV watts page here. If not, speak up. And then I'm going to pick a location. I'm going to just say, okay, we want to design a system for, just out of random, we'll say, let's say Wheeling, West Virginia. Okay. All right. So PV Watts is now selected Wheeling, West Virginia. It's going to give you a map image just to make sure we're talking about the right spot. And then we're going to go in and we're going to make some assumptions here. Now, it asks you for your DC system size right off the bat. You don't have to give that to them if all you're trying to do is get the amount of insulation for this location, because the size doesn't matter. But when you start to do calculations, it does matter. What kind of system, what kind of module is it? Well, you can do standard, premium, or thin film. It defaults to standard. That's probably what you're going to be using. Fixed could be open rack. That would be a ground mounted fixed, or fixed roof mounted system. So we'd want to pick that in this case. It depends on if it's on the ground. We can do single axis tracking or 2-axis tracking. We're not going to be doing much of that. Let's just assume a roof mounted system. The system losses, this is where you derate your system. A lot of that just comes from experience. Having installed your systems, you can go into the loss calculator here and it will ask you, okay, soiling, it's saying 2% due to dust. That might be a little bit too high. So let's just say no, I think only about 1%. Shading, well, we've cited this in a place that there's no shading. So I'm going to put that down to 0. I'm not going to factor in snow. Panel mismatch. Well, this is where you get panels that are not, if it was made on a Monday, it may perform worse than if it's made on a Wednesday. But when you hook them up together, you operate at the lowest common denominator. Wiring, what they're talking about is voltage drop there. We want to keep that at around 2%. Connections, 0.5%, not necessarily unrealistic. Light induced degradation, that's LID. LID is something that happens with solar panels where after you start using them within the first couple of weeks, they tend to degrade. Then it happens at the beginning and then it doesn't happen again. So when you talk about a panel losing 0.5% of its production every year for 25 years, well, 3 years worth of it happens in the first week. Then it slows down. So let's leave that in there. Nameplate rating, not really 100% sure what that's about. Losses, oh, the accuracy. Did their measurements match? You know what? That's getting kind of picky. These guys are pretty well tested. And then system availability. System availability is basically saying sometimes it's down for maintenance and the like, grid failure. We should reduce for that.
Hello?
But yeah, can you hear me, Mark? Or Mark, you have a comment?
Oh, no, sorry, I didn't. I'm sorry.
Okay, no problem. No problem. All right, so they do put a factor here, and for production, it might impact that if the system is down for a period of time, that's going to affect production. But when I'm designing it, I don't want to count on that. So if I take that out of there, now it's saying that my system is going to have about a 9.61 fallout. Now, how did that happen? Jumped there. No, so 6.81. 6.81. Yeah. Okay, so now it's just, so that's how you can calculate your losses. So that basically is saying this system is about 93% efficient, which is pretty good. Now you're going to want to measure the tilt, the angle of your roof. So to do that, the best mechanism I would suggest is when you're out there, just use your phone. There are apps you can put on there. You just put it on the roof and it'll tell you the angle. If it's like a 412 or whatever, you can use the table in the book that'll give it to you. And then the azimuth is how close to solar south is this thing functioning? So 180 degrees is true south. So let's say you do a measurement or you use one of the tools that'll give you a measurement and we find it's 150 degrees. So you factor that in. And let's say we measured this and it's actually 25 degrees. So you throw that in. And then you click on this and it's going to tell you how much insulation given at that location with those conditions that you just put in there. So this is saying that in Wheeling, West Virginia, in that orientation, at that angle, this system will produce 4.4 hours of insulation every year on average. It'll also give you the monthly breakdown. So obviously in the summertime, you get a lot more sunlight than you get in the wintertime. And these numbers are going to be important later on when we're doing some of the math designs for sizing your system, for sizing your strings, things like that. So this is where you get those numbers. You just go into PV Watts. It's a very powerful program, a lot of good information about it. And this is there's a lab in there that you're going to go through to do that. If you get numbers that aren't exactly 100% back with what is in the lab, double check it. Sometimes they adjust these numbers, so you might be off slightly. Or maybe I've seen where maybe roof mounted versus open rack, you can play with that or adjust the losses. Anyway, so that's NREL. I just wanted to give you a brief overview. PV Watts is a tool that you use all the time when you're trying to estimate your system, how much insulation you're going to get. They also have this tool here, the rooftop estimator. You can go in and you can use this tool. For example, it's pulling it in based on if we gave them an address, it would give us a specific address. So obviously this is I would assume, I say obviously, but it must be Wheeling, West Virginia. It's coming in. If you give them a specific address, it's going to do that. So let's say that our building, this happens to be our building. We would just, I've never used this one. So, oh, that's interesting. Yeah, I better not. I better play with this before I show you this. I'm going to show you a different tool. This is very rudimentary for doing rooftop design. So there's a little tutorial here you can go through on that. But in the meantime, I want to go into Open Solar. And I would recommend that you sign up for Open Solar. It's a free program. and you can use it for designing your systems. And so if you want to set up a new project, you would just type in a new project here, project address, or you can open up some existing projects. So in this case, I'll just open up a recent one that I did, and it will show you customer information here. You can put in the address. So when you're generating a proposal, all that data is in here. And then you go and you would enter in the energy. You would get this from their utility bill. So you just simply, and what I've already done here is entered in the monthly profile of how much energy they used each month. And then you want to select a tariff. Here we selected a tariff, the Paulding Putnam Electric Co-op tariff, residential, or you could just put in a flat rate. If you wanted to put in a flat rate, you just put the price of electricity per kilowatt hour. And that's an easy way of doing that. Okay. Any questions on this so far? It's pretty straightforward. You're just going to take information from their utility bill and do it. Then we want to go into the design. And the design is going to take the building, and it uses Google Maps here. There is an option, because sometimes these maps, like you can see here, this map is pretty blurry. So there are options in it. I think if I go up here, it's going to say, okay, do you want to switch? Do you want to switch to Bing? So if I switch to Bing, it might give me a better picture. Doesn't look like it did. I don't see that being any different, really. I'll go back to Google. Whoa, now I've lost in all the switching back and forth. I think I've messed up my design. It's gotten off track slightly. Maybe I better go to Bing. Maybe that's what it was designed in. There we go. All right, so you can just toggle back and forth on that. This is actually this particular one is an ice cream retail outlet right up on the river. So what they wanted is just to see what's the maximum capacity here. So we just simply put as many panels on this roof as would realistically fit. And then it's saying over here, we can select our panels. We can select the cost of each of these panels. So I picked QPeak. You can select your mounting hardware. I didn't bother on here. Inverters. You can get better, and you can also put in batteries, all of that. But for this, we just simply wanted to get a basic system. And I think we also put in the pricing. So the pricing on it, I just manually entered in $2.50 per watt. So that was based on industry averages for systems that size in that location. And that's where they came up with this $43,350. It's a 17.34 kW array based on the size of the roof. Multiplying that times $2.50 a watt, you end up with $43,350. Now, based on the energy consumption that I already put in, it's only going to be producing about 19% of the electrical needs of this facility. So the roof space is inadequate for what they need, but it's what they got. All right. And then I can plug in incentives. So these incentives, in this case, they were applying for a REAP grant, REAP grants are Rural Energy for America program, and they're up to 50% of the cost of the system. So $21,675 is 50%. And then there's investment tax credits. That's 30% of the tax credit that's available there. So that's going to be 13,000. So once you plugged into the incentives, then you can go ahead and generate a proposal. So what would the proposal look like? You know, it's going to have a cover letter. And in this case, it's saying, okay, 19% of your consumption offset. It's going to save you $50,818 over the life. How they figure that, you know, is their mystery. The total cost of the system to install, the net cost, is $8,670. That's the cost minus the incentives. It shows a little diagram of what it's going to look like on the property. It's going to show how much it's going to produce each year, and that's based on the angle. It pulls that information from PV Watts, and then it gives them some pretty pictures. And really what they're always getting back to is what's the payback. On this, it's saying that after your initial investment, you're going to reach payback in 4 years, 2 months. Well, basically it's saying, okay, based on your utility rate, the cost of electricity that you're saving obviously is going to be somewhere around $2,000 a year. So 4 years and some change to pay that back. And then you could print out a proposal here. And so that's how these systems work. So this is the kind of initial sales proposal that you would go out to a customer. The nice thing about one of these kind of systems is you don't have to make a trip. You know, if you're getting people calling you up saying, hey, I want you to tell me how much it's going to cost me to install this system on my local ice cream shop, and this happens to be located somewhere up near Toledo. Well, I don't necessarily want to drive from here 4 hours to go up and take pictures of this. I can do this assessment here, and I can see, is shading going to be an issue? What's the size of the roof? You know, all of that I can do remotely. If I do get the contract, at some point I got to go up there, because these pictures are based on Google Earth for the most part, or Bing. They can be old. They can be years out of date. There may be trees that have come down, trees that have been put up, buildings that have been constructed. So I need to go and do a site assessment because this data is old. And so you cannot get away with doing remote site assessments totally, but you can do them for your initial bid, your initial proposal. So those were the 3 things I wanted to touch on. Is sizing the wire, doing a little quick overview of PV Watts, and doing a little quick overview of Open Solar. Does anybody have any questions before we call this a day here? Okay, hearing none, I'll just remind you that I'm not going to hold this session next week. We'll return the week after, but if you have any questions, you know, send me an email. I'll be in touch by email and I'll get back to you directly. And if it's something I think everybody needs to hear, I'll just copy everybody on that response. All right. Well, enjoy, study hard, and we'll see you guys in 2 weeks. All right. Take care. Bye-bye.